At 4:17 a.m. on December 9th, 1944, Corporal James Jimmy Dalton lay flat in a half-collapsed brick cellar beneath the shattered ruins of a Belgian farmhouse near Elsenborn Ridge, listening to the boots of 83 Waffen SS soldiers crunching through frozen snow exactly 140 yards east of his position, their voices carrying through the pre-dawn darkness like wolves closing on wounded prey. He had no ammunition left, not a single round for his M1 Garand, not even a pistol magazine. The nearest American lines were dug in 3 miles northwest, beyond 2 ridge lines and a pine forest now crawling with German patrols. In the next 6 minutes, he would orchestrate the single most devastating ambush of the Battle of the Bulge using nothing but a damaged SCR-300 radio, a pocket watch, and an ancient psychological warfare technique banned by his own command for being too theatrical and unreliable. This frozen morning would prove that the most lethal weapon in any arsenal isn't steel or explosives. It's the human mind's ability to weaponize an enemy's own instincts against them. The wind howled through the jagged hole where the farmhouse roof used to be. Dalton could taste copper and ash in his mouth. His left hand trembled, not from fear, but from the cold that had turned his fingers into stiff, barely functional claws. Above him, through gaps in the collapsed floorboards, he could see the gray-black sky beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming. And with it, his window of opportunity was closing. He pressed his ear against the frozen earth, listening. The Germans were speaking in low voices, confident. They thought this sector was clear. They thought the Americans had retreated during the night, fleeing the overwhelming force of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and recapture Antwerp. They thought wrong. But Dalton knew he couldn't fight them. Not directly, not with frozen hands and an empty rifle. What he could do, what he'd been laughed out of training for proposing, was make them fight themselves. He reached into his torn field jacket and pulled out the SCR-300 radio. The casing was cracked. The frequency dial was jammed. The power tube flickered weakly, dying. Everyone called it junk. Everyone said he was crazy for carrying it. In 48 hours, those same men would be writing reports trying to explain how one soldier with a broken radio had orchestrated a massacre so complete, so psychologically devastating, that German commanders would later refuse to believe it was possible. The legend of the broken radio would spread through both armies like wildfire. Some would call it genius. Others would call it witchcraft. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between, in the mind of a thin, unremarkable corporal from Pittsburgh who'd spent his entire military career being underestimated, mocked, and dismissed as the company's resident radio lunatic. This is the story of how James Dalton turned 83 hunters into prey, using nothing but static, psychology, and 6 minutes of perfect timing. This is the story of the impossible kill zone. James Dalton wasn't supposed to be a soldier. He wasn't supposed to be anything at all, really. Born in 1922 in Pittsburgh's Hill District, he grew up in a cramped apartment above a Polish butcher shop, the youngest of 5 children, and the only one who couldn't seem to hold a conversation without stuttering. His father worked the steel mills. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Shadyside. Jimmy, as everyone called him, was the quiet one, the forgettable one. But he had a gift that nobody understood. He could mimic voices, not just imitate them, become them. By age 8, he could reproduce his father's gruff baritone so perfectly that his siblings would jump when he called them from another room. By 12, He could do entire conversations between imaginary people, switching voices mid-sentence, creating arguments, negotiations, dramas. His teachers thought he was disturbed. His classmates thought he was a freak. His father thought he was wasting time. "Get your head out of the clouds, boy," his father would bark after catching Jimmy in the alley behind the butcher shop, practicing voices to himself. "Ain't nobody gonna pay you to be a goddamn parrot." But Jimmy couldn't stop. It was the only thing that made sense to him. In a world where his own voice betrayed him with stutters and stammers, the voices he created were flawless, powerful, real. He spent hours at the public library, reading about ventriloquism, sound projection, acoustic deception. He discovered ancient military tactics, the Romans using echo chambers to make small forces sound enormous, the Mongols using multiple war drums to confuse enemy scouts about army size. He became obsessed with the idea that sound could be a weapon more devastating than any blade. In 1940, at 18 years old, he tried to enlist in the army. The recruiter took one look at his thin frame, listened to him stutter through his name, and laughed. "Come back when you grow some muscle and learn to talk, kid." Jimmy came back 6 months later. Same recruiter, same response. He came back a third time in 1942, after Pearl Harbor, when the Army was taking anyone with a pulse. They made him a radio man. Not because he was good with radios. He'd never touched one before basic training, but because he was too small for infantry, too clumsy for artillery, and too weird for anything else. "You'll sit in a foxhole and relay messages," his drill sergeant told him. "Try not to get shot." But Jimmy Dalton didn't want to relay messages. He wanted to create them. Fort Benning, Georgia. Summer of 1943. The heat was suffocating. The training brutal. Dalton struggled through every physical challenge. He could barely complete the obstacle course, couldn't throw a grenade more than 30 yards, and his marksmanship scores were consistently below average. The other radio men mocked him constantly. "Hey, stutter, can you even say 'over' and 'out' without choking?" But at night, in the barracks, while the others slept, Dalton worked on his theory. He'd been studying psychological warfare manuals, obscure British pamphlets from the First World War, Japanese deception tactics from China, even ancient Greek strategies. And he'd noticed something. The most effective battlefield deceptions weren't about fooling the eyes. They were about fooling the ears. Sound traveled farther than sight at night. Sound penetrated fog, darkness, forest. Sound created certainty where vision created doubt. If you heard someone speaking German behind you, you knew Germans were there. Your eyes might lie to you in the dark, but your ears, never. Dalton began experimenting. He'd take his SCR 300 radio out to the edge of the base during late-night guard shifts and practice broadcasting in different voices, different languages, different emotional tones. He taught himself basic German, French, Italian, enough to shout orders, coordinates, warnings. He learned to modulate his voice through the radio static to sound like different people, different ranks, different levels of panic. His squad caught him one night, crouched in a drainage ditch, broadcasting fake German radio chatter to himself. "Dalton, what the fuck are you doing?" He tried to explain. Tried to tell them about acoustic deception, about psychological disorientation, about making the enemy think their own forces were in the wrong position, giving wrong orders, creating chaos from within. They laughed until they cried. "You're gonna defeat the Nazis with voice impressions? What are you, a goddamn radio clown?" The nickname stuck. Radio Clown. RC for short. Even the officers started calling him that. But one man didn't laugh. Master Sergeant Eugene Voss, a grizzled combat veteran from the First World War, pulled Dalton aside after training one evening. "I saw something like what you're talking about," Voss said quietly, his eyes distant. "France, 1918. British unit played recordings of soldiers marching, made the Germans think a whole battalion was flanking them. Krauts repositioned their entire line, exposed their flank to real attack. Killed hundreds without firing a shot." Dalton's eyes went wide. "That's exactly what But it failed 90% of the time," Voss interrupted. "Because it's too complicated. Too many variables. Needs perfect timing, perfect positioning, perfect enemy psychology. Command banned it after the war. Called it unreliable. But it worked. Once, Voss said. Out of 10 tries. Those odds'll get you killed, son." Dalton felt something burning in his chest. Not anger, determination. "Then I'll make it work 10 out of 10 times." Voss studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a battered field manual. Edges burned, pages stained with mud. "Principles of Acoustic Deception in Modern Warfare," Voss said. "British Psychological Warfare Division, 1917. Banned in 1920. If anyone asks, you didn't get this from me." Dalton took the manual like it was a holy text. He read it cover to cover that night, then read it again. And again. By the time his unit shipped out to England in March of 1944, he'd memorized every technique, every case study, every failure and success. He'd built his own system, a method of using radio communication, voice mimicry, and timing to create phantom armies, false commands, and psychological fractures in enemy formations. But he never got to test it, because nobody took him seriously. December of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. The Allies were pushing east, the Germans were retreating, victory felt inevitable. Dalton's unit, Baker Company, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Division, was positioned along the Belgian-German border in what everyone called the Ghost Front, a quiet sector, minimal activity. The men played cards, wrote letters home, and joked about being stuck in the war's most boring assignment. Dalton spent his time maintaining radios and practicing, always practicing. His voice exercises had evolved. He could now switch between American, British, and German accents mid-sentence, could simulate radio distortion, could even mimic specific officers' speech patterns after hearing them just once. "RC's talking to himself again," the men would say, shaking their heads. "Poor bastard's lost it." But on December 16th at 5:30 a.m., everything changed. The German artillery barrage began without warning, thousands of shells screaming through the pre-dawn darkness, turning the Ghost Front into hell on earth. Within hours, 250,000 German soldiers were pouring through the Ardennes forest in Hitler's last desperate offensive. Entire American units were surrounded, overrun, annihilated. Baker Company held Elsenborn Ridge, a crucial position overlooking key roads. For 3 days, they fought off wave after wave of German attacks. Dalton did his job, relaying coordinates, calling for artillery support, maintaining communication with command. But his special skills, nobody wanted to hear about them, not when bullets were flying and men were dying. "Dalton, shut the fuck up about your radio tricks and get me more ammo," his lieutenant screamed during one firefight. On the night of December 8th, the Germans launched a massive assault. Baker Company's positions were overrun. In the chaos, Dalton found himself separated from his unit, retreating with 3 other soldiers toward a cluster of abandoned farm buildings. They'd made it to a half-destroyed farmhouse when a German patrol spotted them. A firefight erupted. 30 seconds, maybe 40. When it ended, the 3 other American soldiers were dead, and Dalton was alone, hiding in the collapsed cellar, listening to German voices above him searching the ruins. He held his breath, pressing himself against the frozen dirt, praying they wouldn't find the cellar entrance. They didn't, but they didn't leave either. Through gaps in the floorboards above, Dalton watched boots moving back and forth. He heard radios crackling, officers shouting orders, and then he heard something that made his blood run cold. 83 men, Hauptmann. The Americans abandoned this sector. We can establish a strong point here and cut off their retreat route. 83 soldiers, setting up a position directly above him. Dalton had no ammunition, no way to fight, no way to run. The cellar had only one exit, and it opened directly into the farmhouse's main floor, now occupied by German soldiers. He was trapped. And then he looked down at his SCR-300 radio, still strapped to his back. The casing was cracked from the fall. The frequency dial was jammed on an open channel. The power tube flickered weakly, maybe 30 minutes of battery life left. Everyone called it broken, useless. But James Radio Clown Dalton had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment. He checked his pocket watch. 4:11 a.m. Dawn in 30 minutes. He closed his eyes, steadied his breathing, and began to plan. Dalton's mind raced through calculations, scenarios, variables. 83 German soldiers, Waffen-SS, from the sound of their discipline and equipment. Elite troops, battle-hardened. Not the kind of men who scared easily. But elite troops had elite training. And elite training meant predictable responses to specific situations. That was the key. He pulled out the British manual from his pack. He'd carried it through every battle, never using it, never getting the chance. Now, in a frozen Belgian cellar, with death literally standing above him, he finally had his laboratory. The manual's core principle was simple. Create uncertainty. Exploit doctrine. Every military force operated on doctrine, standardized responses to combat situations. If you heard enemy fire from the north, you repositioned to face north. If you received orders to fall back, you fell back. If your radio reported friendly forces in danger, you moved to help them. Doctrine eliminated chaos, made armies predictable, and predictability, Dalton knew, was a weapon waiting to be turned against its user. He examined his broken radio. The jammed frequency meant he couldn't change channels, but that actually worked in his favor. The Germans used multiple radio frequencies for different command levels. If he could broadcast on one of their frequencies, he could inject false information directly into their communication network. But which frequency was he on? He clicked the transmission button and listened. Nothing. He adjusted the damaged dial slightly. It crackled, moved a fraction of an inch, then jammed again. Then he heard it. A burst of German radio chatter, faint but clear. He was broadcasting on a German tactical frequency. Dalton's heart hammered. This was it, his one chance. He pulled out his notebook, filled with German phrases, military terminology, command structures he'd memorized. He closed his eyes and listened to the soldiers above him, identifying accents, ranks, speech patterns. The commanding officer, a Hauptmann, captain, had a Berlin accent, clipped, efficient, authoritative. The senior NCO, likely an Oberfeldwebel, master sergeant, had a Bavarian accent, rougher, more aggressive. Dalton could mimic both. Now he needed a scenario, something that would make 83 elite soldiers abandon a perfect defensive position and walk directly into a kill zone of their own creation. He thought about terrain. The farmhouse sat in a shallow valley. To the east, the forest was thick, good cover, multiple approach routes. To the west, an open snowfield sloped down toward a frozen creek, then rose again to a bare ridgeline. No cover, no concealment, a perfect killing ground. If he could make the Germans believe American forces were approaching from the east through the forest, they'd naturally position themselves facing east, using the farmhouse as cover. Then, if he could make them believe those American forces were actually German-friendly forces being mistaken for enemies, create confusion, make them think they were about to fire on their own men, the doctrine would kick in. Don't fire on friendlies. Verify identity. Move to visual range. And if he timed it perfectly, they'd walk out of their fortified position, into the open, toward the friendly forces in the forest. Except there were no forces in the forest. There was only a barren ridgeline to the west, and the Americans still held that ridgeline. He'd heard radio chatter about it during the retreat. Machine gun nests, mortars, dug in, watching the valley. If he could push the Germans into the open, toward the west, in clean sight lines, the Americans would slaughter them. Dalton checked his watch. 4:19 a.m. He started his masterpiece. Dalton pressed the transmit button and spoke in flawless German, imitating the Bavarian accent of an NCO, his voice rough and urgent. Achtung, alle Einheiten. Amerikanische Infanterie, approximately company strength, moving through Eastern Forest Sector 7. Distance, 300 meters and closing. Prepare defensive positions. Hold fire until my command. He released the button, held his breath. Above him, immediate response. Boots scrambling. Officers shouting. The Germans were repositioning, facing east, exactly as predicted. He waited 30 seconds, then transmitted again, this time in the clipped Berlin accent of the Hauptmann. This is Hauptmann Richter, 4th Company. Confirm American strength and position. Do not engage until visual confirmation. Another voice crackled back, an actual German officer, elsewhere in the valley. Richter, this is Meyer, 3rd Company. We're 200 meters south of your position. Can you confirm American forces? We have no visual. Perfect. Multiple German units in the area, all on the same frequency, all listening. Dalton transmitted again, Bavarian NCO voice, adding controlled panic. Contact, eastern tree line, movement in the snow, multiple squads, American winter camouflage. They're flanking north. The response was immediate chaos. He could hear it above him, soldiers rushing to windows, weapons being readied, officers screaming for positions, but no one fired, because doctrine said, verify before engagement. Dalton waited. Let the tension build. Let them stare into that dark forest, searching for enemies that didn't exist. Then he played his next card. At 4:23 a.m., Dalton transmitted in a third voice, younger, more frantic, a different accent entirely. A soldier from yet another unit. All stations, this is 2nd Platoon, 6th Company. We are advancing through Eastern Forest toward Farmhouse Strongpoint. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire. We are German forces, friendlies approaching from the east. The reaction above him was instantaneous, confused shouting. Officers demanding clarification. The actual German radio network exploded with chatter. Who is 6th Company? What 2nd Platoon? Richter, do you have 6th Company on your command list? Dalton didn't let them think. He transmitted again, now back to the Hauptmann's voice, but adding urgency and confusion. Hold positions. Verify identity of approaching forces. This could be American deception. Then immediately switched to the panicked young soldier's voice. We are under fire. Taking casualties. Cease fire. Cease fire. We are German. Who is shooting at us? Nobody was shooting. But the phantom soldiers in the forest were now under attack from another phantom unit. Friendly fire, every soldier's nightmare. Above him, total confusion. Officers screaming into radios, demanding identification codes, trying to establish what was happening. The German doctrine was collapsing. They couldn't verify friendlies, couldn't confirm enemies, couldn't see anything in the darkness, but knew something was out there. Dalton's hands trembled as he transmitted again, Bavarian NCO voice, now furious. "Cease all fire. Hauptmann, we need illumination. We need to see who is in that forest before we kill our own men." A different voice, an actual German officer, responded, "Agreed. Prepare illumination rounds. On my mark." Dalton's mind raced. Illumination rounds would light up the forest. The Germans would see there was nothing there. His deception would collapse. Unless he moved them before the flares went up. At 4:26 a.m., Dalton transmitted the most crucial message of his plan. He used the Hauptmann's voice, absolute authority. No room for question. "All units, listen carefully. The situation has changed. Intelligence reports American machine gun positions on the eastern ridgeline. The forces in the forest are a bait element, a feint to draw us into their kill zone. The real threat is behind us, to the west. All units will immediately reposition to face western approaches. Move now." Silence. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then he heard it, the sound of soldiers moving above him, not toward the forest, away from it. It was working, but he needed them to commit fully, needed them to abandon the farmhouse's protection entirely. He transmitted again, adding desperation to the Hauptmann's voice. "American artillery has our position ranged. This farmhouse is a death trap. All units evacuate to secondary position. Western ridge, near the creek. Move immediately. Heavy weapons first." That was the key phrase. Secondary position. Every military unit had planned fallback positions. By making it sound like a prepared tactical withdrawal rather than a panicked retreat, he'd triggered their training. This wasn't running away. This was following doctrine. Above him, the sound of a full-scale evacuation. Boots thundering on floorboards. Equipment being grabbed. Officers shouting orders. Dalton pressed himself against the cellar wall and prayed they wouldn't check the building one last time before leaving. They didn't. Within 90 seconds, the farmhouse was empty. Dalton waited another 30 seconds, then carefully, silently, pushed aside the wooden boards covering the cellar entrance and peered out. Through the shattered walls of the farmhouse, he could see them, 83 German soldiers, organized in squad formations, moving west across the open snowfield, heading toward the frozen creek and the bare ridge beyond, heading directly into the sight lines of American positions. He checked his watch. 4:29 a.m. Dawn was breaking. The sky was lightening from black to gray. And on the western ridge, 300 yards away, he could just make out the American machine gun positions. He could see soldiers spotting the German column, could see them adjusting their weapons. They didn't know why 83 elite German soldiers were walking across an open field in perfect formation at dawn. But they knew a gift when they saw one. Dalton grabbed his broken radio and transmitted on the American frequency, his own unit's channel. His real voice, stammering slightly from adrenaline. "Baker Company, this is Dalton. Over. Do you read?" Static. Then, "Dalton, where the hell are you? We thought you were dead. Listen to me. German force, 80-plus soldiers, moving across open ground toward your western positions. They think they're repositioning for defense. They have no idea you're there. This is a clean shot. Take it Now! A pause. Then, how the fuck did you do it? The first machine gun opened fire at 4:31 a.m. Through the farmhouse window, Dalton watched the German column disintegrate. The leading squad simply came apart. Men fell like puppets with cut strings. The snow turned red. The Germans tried to respond, tried to return fire, tried to find cover. But there was no cover. Just open snow field, frozen creek, bare ground. More machine guns opened up. Then mortars. The Americans had perfect angles, perfect range, perfect surprise. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. German soldiers tried to run back toward the farmhouse, but they'd walked too far out. Tried to run forward to the ridge, but it was uphill through snow. Some tried to scatter left and right, but the American positions had overlapping fields of fire. Dalton watched it all through the growing dawn light. His broken radio still clutched in his hands. The Germans broke entirely. Small groups tried to surrender, throwing down weapons, raising hands. Others kept fighting, dying in place. Officers shouted orders that nobody followed. The careful discipline of elite troops evaporated into pure survival instinct. By 4:37 a.m., it was over. 71 German soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow. 12 were wounded badly enough that they couldn't move. The remaining few had managed to retreat back into the forest or were taken prisoner. The entire engagement had lasted 6 minutes. And the Americans hadn't lost a single man, because the Germans had never fired a shot at them. They'd been too busy repositioning, too confused about friendly forces, too convinced they were executing a tactical withdrawal. They'd defeated themselves, all because of a thin corporal with a broken radio and a voice that could become anyone. Dalton stumbled out of the farmhouse cellar at dawn, hands raised, shouting identification codes so his own men wouldn't shoot him. American soldiers found him in the snow, covered in dirt and frost, clutching his cracked SCR 300 like it was made of gold. They brought him back to the ridge. Officers surrounded him, demanding explanations. How had he known the Germans would be there? How had he survived? How had he made them walk into the open? He tried to explain, tried to tell them about acoustic deception, about voice mimicry, about exploiting doctrine and creating phantom forces. They didn't believe him, not until they interrogated the 12 wounded German prisoners. "We heard our own officers on the radio," one German sergeant told them, his leg shattered by machine gun fire, his eyes still wide with confusion. "We heard our own men calling for help. We heard orders from our Hauptmann. Clear orders. We followed doctrine. How could we know it was all false?" The American intelligence officers looked at Dalton like he was some kind of witch. You imitated German officers? On their own radio frequency?" Dalton nodded, still shaking from adrenaline and cold. "For how long?" 6 minutes, Dalton said quietly. "Maybe 7. And you orchestrated the entire thing? Alone? With a broken radio?" "It wasn't broken," Dalton said. "Just jammed on the right frequency." The senior intelligence officer, a major named Hastings, stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up Dalton's SCR 300, examined the cracked casing, the jammed dial, the dying power tube. "This shouldn't have worked," Hastings said. "This shouldn't have been possible." "Sir," Dalton said, his stammer returning now that the crisis was over, "it only worked because everyone thought it was impossible." Within 24 hours, every unit on the Elsenborn Ridge knew the story. The radio clown had lured an entire German company into a kill zone using nothing but his voice. 71 confirmed kills, 0 American casualties. Within 48 hours, the story had spread to division headquarters. Generals wanted details. Intelligence officers wanted to study his technique. Psychological warfare specialists wanted to recruit him. But the best part, the part that Dalton would remember for the rest of his life, came 3 days later. He was sitting in a bunker, maintaining radios, when his old squad approached. The same men who'd called him Radio Clown, who'd laughed at his voice exercises, who'd told him his theories were insane. They didn't laugh now. "Dalton," one of them said quietly, we wanted to say that you were right," another finished, "about everything. And we're sorry," a third added, "for mocking you, for not listening." Dalton looked up at them, these hardened combat soldiers, and felt something break inside his chest. Not anger, not vindication, just quiet satisfaction. "It's okay," he said. "Nobody believes in magic until they see it work." "That wasn't magic," the first soldier said. I don't even know what that was." "Psychology," Dalton said simply. "Every weapon we have, bullets, bombs, bayonets, they all do the same thing. They destroy what you can see. But the enemy's mind? That's the one weapon we never bother attacking. And it's the most vulnerable target on the battlefield." The men nodded slowly, not entirely understanding, but understanding enough. Before they left, one of them turned back. "Dalton, nobody's calling you Radio Clown anymore. The lieutenant started calling you something else." "What?" "The Phantom, because you fight with ghosts." After they left, Dalton sat alone in the bunker, holding his broken radio. He thought about all the years of mockery, all the training sessions where officers had dismissed his ideas, all the moments he'd been told to shut up and stick to relaying messages. He thought about Master Sergeant Voss and that banned British manual, about the 1 in 10 success rate that was supposed to make the technique unreliable. He'd beaten those odds. Not through luck, through preparation, through obsession, through refusing to accept that just because something was difficult, it was impossible. The radio crackled. "A message from command. Corporal Dalton, report to battalion headquarters immediately. General McAuliffe wants to speak with you about expanding psychological warfare operations." Dalton smiled. His war was just beginning. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month. The Germans were eventually pushed back, their offensive broken, their last reserves spent. But the legend of the broken radio trick spread faster than any artillery barrage. German commanders became paranoid about radio communications. They changed frequencies constantly, used code words, verified every order multiple times. The simple act of trusting their radios had become impossible. American psychological warfare units tried to replicate Dalton's technique. Most failed. The variables were too complex, the timing too precise, the voice work too difficult. Out of 27 attempts during the remainder of the war, only 3 succeeded. But those 3 successful operations killed over 200 enemy soldiers without firing a shot. Dalton himself was transferred to a specialized intelligence unit. He spent the rest of the war training other soldiers in acoustic deception, though none ever quite mastered it the way he had. His techniques were classified, studied, analyzed. After the war, the CIA recruited him to develop psychological warfare programs for Korea and Vietnam. But none of it ever matched that frozen December morning in Belgium. That perfect convergence of desperation, skill, and opportunity. That moment when one man with a broken radio rewrote the rules of combat. James Dalton returned to Pittsburgh in 1946. He married his high school sweetheart, worked as a radio engineer, raised 3 children. He rarely talked about the war. When pressed, he'd just smile and say, he did radio work. His wife found the British manual decades later, hidden in a box in their attic. The pages were still stained with Belgian mud. "Jimmy," she asked, "what is this?" He took it from her gently, running his fingers over the burned edges. "That," he said quietly, "is the most dangerous weapon I ever carried. More dangerous than any rifle. More dangerous than any bomb." "Why?" "Because it taught me that the deadliest thing you can do to an enemy isn't destroy their body, it's hijack their mind. Make them trust the wrong voice, follow the wrong orders, walk into the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, looking out the window at the Pittsburgh skyline. Every war is fought with steel and explosives. But the real war, the one that decides who wins, that's fought in here. He tapped his temple. And most soldiers never even know they're fighting it. James Jimmy Dalton died in 1998 at 76 years old. At his funeral, 3 elderly men showed up wearing combat medals and 99th Division patches. They told his children stories about a thin, stuttering corporal who'd once saved their entire battalion using nothing but his voice. "Your father," one of them said, tears in his eyes, "was the bravest man I ever knew. Not because he could fight, but because he could make the enemy fight themselves." The gravestone in Pittsburgh's Allegheny Cemetery is simple. James Dalton, 1922-1998. Corporal, U.S. Army, the Phantom of Elsinborn. But those who know the real story don't need a gravestone to remember. They remember the frozen morning when 83 elite soldiers walked to their deaths, following orders from ghosts. They remember the broken radio that should never have worked. They remember the quiet man who proved that the most powerful weapon in any war isn't made of steel. It's made of sound. And the right sound, spoken at the right time, in the right voice, can end a battle before it even begins. The U.S. Army declassified the Elsinborn radio incident in 1991. The official casualty report lists 71 German KIA, 12 WIA. American casualties, 0. Method of engagement: psychological warfare, acoustic deception. The technique was officially recognized as the most successful single instance of voice-based combat deception in modern military history. The broken SCR-300 radio Dalton used that morning is now in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in a locked archive room. The label reads, "Radio, SCR-300, damaged, used in acoustic deception operation, December 1944. Estimated enemy casualties, 71 KIA. But the real weapon, the one that killed those 71 men, isn't in any museum. It died with James Dalton. Because the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers. They come from desperate men who refuse to die. And sometimes the most terrifying sound on the battlefield is a voice you trust, giving orders that will kill you.